The officer had just finished a long day of patrolling, his mind focused on the usual routine of keeping the streets safe. He was well aware of the neighborhood's reputation and knew the traffic conditions better than anyone. He had pulled over his share of drivers, but this stop felt different for some reason, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The officer's patrol car hummed as he drove through the quiet streets. He spotted a sleek, black sports car speeding down the road, almost too fast for his liking. Instinctively, his hand reached for the siren, and with a flick of the switch, the blue lights flashed, cutting through the calm night air. The sports car didn't slow down immediately, which made the officer more alert. It was a dark, narrow road, and he had seen accidents happen too many times before. After a few seconds, the sports car finally pulled over to the side of the road. The officer's grip tightened on the wheel as he steered his patrol car in behind it. He took a deep breath and adjusted his hat, his face set in a stern expression. The stop seemed routine, but something about it stirred a feeling of uncertainty inside him. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the sports car, which sat low to the ground, the kind of car that made heads turn. As he approached, he noticed the car's glossy exterior and the unmistakable hum of an expensive engine. This wasn't just any car. This was the type of car that screamed wealth, luxury, and success. It was a little surprising to see a car like this in a neighborhood like theirs. Most people around here didn't drive something so flashy, and the officer couldn't help but wonder about the driver's background. He had seen plenty of sports cars, but the way this one gleamed in the streetlight caught his attention in a way that made him slightly uneasy. The officer tapped on the driver's side window. A moment passed before the window slowly rolled down, revealing the driver. It was a black man, probably in his mid-30s. His expression was calm, his face collected, but there was a certain air about him, something the officer couldn't quite place. The man's eyes met the officer's, and he gave a polite, though slightly reserved, smile. The officer didn't waste any time. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The man nodded, but didn't respond immediately. The officer's eyes flicked over to the dashboard, and then back to the man. "I clocked you going over the speed limit," he continued. "Mind if I see your license and registration?" The driver's calmness struck the officer. The man didn't seem worried, didn't seem nervous, just unbothered. He reached into his glove compartment, pulling out his papers and handing them over without hesitation. The officer briefly glanced at them before returning his attention to the driver. The man's demeanor made the officer a little more suspicious. Why wasn't he acting like most people did when pulled over? Was he hiding something? The officer couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. The car was too expensive, and the man's coolness too confident. Something about this situation didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't figure out why just yet. As he took a moment to process what he had in front of him, his mind began to churn with possibilities, but he would soon find out that there was more to this story than his initial assumptions. The officer stood silently for a moment, his hand resting on the car door as he took in the situation. His eyes returned to the man in the driver's seat, trying to read his expression. The man didn't look nervous, not at all. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't avoiding eye contact, and there was no sign of stress in his posture. The officer had pulled over enough drivers to know that something was off. Most people, when they get pulled over, either panic or get defensive. But this man just sat there, calm as could be. There was a soft hum from the engine of the sports car, the sound of the idle engine filling the space between them. The officer, still standing outside the window, leaned slightly forward to get a better look at the man's face. The more he observed, the more he found himself wondering, was this man really someone who was just passing through, or was there something more? The officer cleared his throat and straightened up. "You know," he said, his voice firm but without the usual edge, "it's not often I see someone with a car like that around here." His words hung in the air, and the man simply looked back at him without any sign of annoyance or defensiveness. He was still calm. It was as if the man had expected this. "Yeah, it's a nice car," the man replied with a slight smile. His voice was steady, almost too steady. He wasn't being arrogant. He wasn't trying to show off either. He seemed almost bored by the conversation, like this was just another routine for him, another day in the life. The officer noticed the lack of arrogance in the man's voice, something that didn't quite match the flashy car. It didn't sit right with him. The officer took the papers the man handed him and began running them through his system, checking the license and registration. As he waited for the confirmation, his mind wandered. Who was this man really? Why was he driving such an expensive car, yet not reacting like someone would when being pulled over? Was he someone important, someone who didn't have to worry about these things? Or was there more to him than met the eye? He looked down at the papers in his hand, scanning the information again. The name on the registration was unfamiliar, but that didn't mean much. He checked the car's make and model. Everything seemed in order. Yet, the officer's instinct kept nagging at him. He had pulled over enough expensive cars to know that many of the drivers were wealthy and influential. Sometimes, they used their status to try to get out of tickets, expecting special treatment. But this man wasn't doing that. He wasn't trying to manipulate the situation. He wasn't even trying to explain himself. Finally, the officer returned the papers. "Everything checks out," he said, his tone softening just slightly. "You're free to go." But even as he spoke, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on here. The man's calmness, the expensive car, the way he carried himself, everything felt like it didn't belong. But what the officer didn't know was that the man wasn't just another rich guy passing through town. There was something much more surprising about him, something that would soon be revealed. As the officer handed back the papers, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The man had done everything right, remained respectful, and hadn't tried to argue or make excuses. In fact, the officer was starting to feel more out of place than he had expected. Everything about the situation felt off, but he couldn't figure out exactly why. He had seen drivers in flashy cars before, but there was something about this man that didn't match the usual profile. The officer stood still for a moment, his thoughts swirling. Just as he was about to turn and walk back to his patrol car, his radio crackled to life, breaking his concentration. The dispatcher's voice came through, distant but clear. "Unit 47, can you confirm the details on that black sports car? We have a hit from the dealership database. The owner's name is registered there." The officer froze. He didn't quite understand the full message at first, and his hand hovered over the door handle of his patrol car. He could feel his heartbeat quicken. The words dealership and owner bounced around in his head like a puzzle he couldn't piece together. The man in the sports car, noticing the officer's sudden pause, tilted his head slightly, a small hint of curiosity flickering in his eyes. His calm, composed demeanor never wavered. The radio crackled again. "The owner of the car is the CEO of one of the top dealerships in the city." The officer's mind raced as the information sank in. He looked at the man in front of him again, this time with a growing realization. This wasn't just some ordinary driver with an expensive car. This was the owner of a well-known car dealership. The officer's posture shifted, and his once stern face softened slightly. He hadn't expected this at all. The man sitting in front of him wasn't just someone passing through. He was someone who ran a business, someone important. The officer quickly glanced at the man's car again, almost seeing it in a new light. The sleek, shiny black sports car wasn't just a sign of wealth. It was a symbol of success, something the officer hadn't yet appreciated fully. The man, noticing the change in the officer's expression, gave a small smile. It wasn't smug or prideful, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if he'd been through situations like this before. The officer didn't know what to say. He had assumed the worst about this man, and now, standing there in the street, he realized how wrong he had been. The officer cleared his throat, trying to collect himself. I didn't realize you were the owner," he said, his voice carrying a tone of respect this time. "I'm sorry for the confusion." The man nodded but said nothing, maintaining his calm composure. He wasn't angry, nor did he seem particularly surprised. Instead, he seemed to expect this sort of reaction. He had no reason to get upset. After all, he had done nothing wrong. "I guess this is a little awkward now," the officer added, trying to break the tension. The man finally spoke, his voice steady and quiet. "It happens more often than you'd think." The officer felt the weight of the situation. He had jumped to conclusions based on nothing more than appearances and his own assumptions. He knew it wasn't right to judge people so quickly, yet that was exactly what he had done. The realization hit him harder than he expected. As he stood there, facing the man, the officer couldn't help but reflect on how his own biases had clouded his judgment. He had pulled this man over simply because of his car, without considering who he might actually be. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a harsh reminder of how easy it was to make assumptions about others. The man, still calm and composed, didn't offer much more than a small smile before returning to his car. The officer stepped back, watching him drive away, feeling both a sense of relief and shame. He had learned something important in those few moments, something that would stay with him for a long time. The officer stood there for a few moments, his eyes fixed on the sports car as it slowly drove away. The calmness of the situation had completely thrown him off guard. He had expected a tense, perhaps confrontational encounter, but instead, he had learned an important lesson about assumptions and how quickly they could cloud judgment. As the car disappeared down the street, he let out a deep sigh, his mind still processing what had just happened. Walking back to his patrol car, the officer replayed the scene in his head. It was as if everything had changed in the span of just a few minutes. He had gone from viewing the man as an anonymous, possibly reckless driver to realizing he was someone who had worked hard to build a successful business. The officer had seen many wealthy people in his career, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the car or the money. It was about the man's dignity and his calmness in the face of an unfair situation. It was a humbling moment. The officer got back into his patrol car and sat there for a moment, staring out the window. He wasn't sure if he felt embarrassed or just thoughtful. He had been so quick to judge, so eager to pull someone over for something that turned out to be completely unjustified. He had allowed his personal biases to take control. But now, with the realization settling in, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his own actions. He had been so focused on the car, the shiny sports car, that he had completely ignored the person behind the wheel. It was easy to assume that someone driving such an expensive car must have gotten it through privilege, or maybe even dishonesty. But the truth was, this man had earned everything he had. He had worked hard, built a business from the ground up, and succeeded. And yet, here the officer was, pulling him over just because of the car he drove. It was a hard pill to swallow. The officer's thoughts turned to his own experiences. He had always prided himself on being fair and unbiased. Yet today, in this one small moment, he had proven to himself just how easy it was to let preconceived notions dictate his actions. It wasn't enough to say you were fair. You had to prove it in every moment. The officer thought about how the man had reacted. He hadn't been defensive or angry. Instead, he had simply stayed calm and composed, as if he had expected the officer to treat him with suspicion. Maybe the officer wasn't the only one who had learned something that day. The man had likely experienced moments like this before, perhaps many times over the years. Yet he didn't allow the officer's assumptions to change his behavior. Instead, he had remained dignified and patient. The officer knew that this wasn't just a lesson for him. It was something that would stick with him moving forward. It wasn't enough to act with respect when things went smoothly. It was in those uncomfortable, challenging moments that his true character would be revealed. He had learned that assumptions, no matter how small, could lead to mistakes. And in a profession like his, where fairness and trust were critical, those mistakes could have lasting consequences. As the officer pulled away, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, He realized that this brief encounter with the man in the sports car had given him more than just a lesson in fairness. It had reminded him of the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, not based on their appearances, their cars, or their backgrounds, but based on their actions, their character, and their dignity. The officer's reflection on this moment was something he would carry with him, a reminder to never again judge a book by its cover. The officer's shift continued, but his thoughts kept returning to the encounter earlier that day. Despite the routine calls and reports that came through the radio, the moment with the man in the sports car was still fresh in his mind. It wasn't every day that he had an experience that forced him to confront his own assumptions. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know how to handle almost any situation, but this time, he had learned something about himself that he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the job. It was about how he viewed the world around him. As the evening wore on, the officer found himself thinking about how the man had handled the situation. There hadn't been any anger, no confrontation. The man had simply accepted the officer's initial judgment, knowing that it would eventually be cleared up. But what struck the officer the most was the way the man had stayed calm throughout the entire interaction. He had known exactly how to handle it, as if this was something he had experienced many times before. The officer's mind wandered to the idea of how people, especially those who had succeeded in life, sometimes found themselves labeled or stereotyped. The man in the sports car wasn't just anyone. He was the owner of a business, someone who had worked tirelessly to achieve his success. Yet the officer had treated him as just another person who might be breaking the law, someone he could question and pull over on a whim. It was a harsh reminder of how easy it was to let preconceived notions cloud one's judgment. The officer, feeling a mix of guilt and humility, decided that he needed to take action, not just in terms of being more aware of his own biases, but in how he interacted with people moving forward. His job wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about serving the community with fairness, respect, and understanding. He couldn't allow assumptions to lead his actions. The following day, as the officer reviewed his reports, he made a conscious decision to reach out to the man in the sports car. He knew it wouldn't be easy to find him, but he felt it was necessary to make amends in some way. He wanted to apologize for his actions and make it clear that he had learned from the experience. After all, it was one thing to realize you'd made a mistake. It was another to do something about it. The officer did a little research and after some time, discovered the man's name and the dealership he owned. He drafted a simple letter, expressing his regret for the way he had handled the situation. The letter wasn't long, just a brief note explaining how the officer's assumptions had been wrong and how he appreciated the man's patience and understanding. The officer knew that this might be an unexpected gesture, but he felt it was the right thing to do. After all, if the officer was going to learn from this mistake, he needed to make sure that the man understood that he wasn't just another faceless driver. A few days later, the officer received a response. The letter was short, but it was sincere. The man thanked the officer for reaching out and expressed that he understood how easy it was for assumptions to be made. He also mentioned that he had encountered situations like that before, and it was reassuring to see that the officer had taken the time to reflect on the encounter. The man's response was gracious, and the officer felt a sense of relief. He had made the right choice, and it had opened a door for mutual respect and understanding. As the officer continued his patrols, he kept the man's letter in his glove compartment. It served as a reminder of the lesson he had learned, that fairness didn't just apply to the law, but to how we viewed and treated each other. The officer knew that it was his responsibility to ensure that every person he encountered was treated with the respect they deserved, no matter who they were or where they came from. And as he drove through the streets, his mind was more open, more aware of the complexities of life, and how, sometimes, we all just need a little reminder to see things differently. A few weeks passed since the officer had sent the letter and received the kind reply. Although life continued, the encounter with the man in the sports car and the subsequent reflection stayed with him. As he went about his duties, he found that he was approaching his work with a renewed sense of purpose. Each interaction, whether with a driver or a pedestrian, felt different now. The officer was more mindful, more attentive to the stories that people carried with them, even if they didn't speak about them. He began to notice things he hadn't before. He saw the way people looked at him as he walked up to their cars. Some of them were anxious, some defensive, others resigned. He began to wonder how many times people had been misjudged simply based on their appearance or the car they drove, much like he had done that day. But unlike before, he now recognized the subtle impact of his actions and the power of his assumptions. One afternoon, while on patrol, the officer found himself back in the same neighborhood where he had first pulled over the man. He had driven through these streets countless times, but today felt different. As he passed by familiar streets and landmarks, he started to think about the people in the neighborhood. The ones he passed by every day, who had their own stories, their own challenges. The officer realized how important it was to see people for who they were, not just for the external factors that made them stand out. His mind drifted back to the man in the sports car again. He had realized something that day that he'd never fully grasped before, that so much of his work relied not just on enforcing the law, but also on understanding the people who were caught up in it. A traffic stop wasn't just about issuing a ticket or making an arrest. It was about understanding the context of a person's life and respecting their humanity. As the officer continued his patrol, he found himself stopping at local events more often, attending community meetings and getting involved in outreach programs. He wanted to make sure he was an active part of the community he served. He started to spend more time in places he hadn't paid much attention to before, talking with the people who lived there. He understood that his job wasn't just about driving around in his patrol car. It was about building relationships and earning trust. And then, one day, while sitting in a local coffee shop, he saw the man from the sports car again. This time, the officer didn't hesitate. He stood up, walked over to the man, and introduced himself with a handshake. It wasn't just a casual meeting. It was a moment of connection, one that had been months in the making. The man, who recognized him immediately, smiled warmly, just as he had done during their first encounter. "I'm glad to see you again," the officer said sincerely. "I've been thinking a lot about our first meeting." The man nodded, not surprised by the officer's approach. "I figured you would," he said with a knowing smile. "It's a shame sometimes how we have to learn things the hard way, but I'm glad it made a difference." The officer paused, appreciating the man's calmness once more. "I've learned a lot," he admitted. "It's funny how one moment can change everything. I realize now how much I was missing before." The man leaned back in his chair, listening with genuine interest. "We all have those moments. I've had a few myself." The conversation continued, not as an apology or a grand gesture, but as an honest exchange between two people who had learned something important. The officer realized that the man hadn't just taught him a lesson that day. He had also reminded him of the importance of openness and humility. And as they talked, the officer knew that this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a sign of growth for both of them. By the time they finished their coffee, the officer felt a sense of peace. He wasn't just doing his job anymore. He was living the lessons he had learned, carrying them with him in every part of his life. As he said goodbye and left the coffee shop, he knew that his journey wasn't just about making the right call on the street. It was about making the right call in how he saw and treated others every day. The officer's life began to feel different in the weeks that followed. Every patrol, every conversation, and even every brief encounter felt like an opportunity to practice the lessons he had learned. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was living with a newfound awareness of how important it was to understand the people he encountered. As he patrolled the same streets, he noticed more and more faces, some familiar, some new. Each one had a story, a life, and experiences that shaped who they were. He wasn't just focused on enforcing the law now. He was focused on seeing people for who they truly were. One evening, as he sat in his patrol car parked by the side of the road, he reflected on how far he had come. It was quiet outside, just the hum of the city around him. A few cars passed by, and he thought about the many faces he had seen over the years, faces he had once dismissed, assumed, or misjudged. It was a humbling realization. His thoughts often returned to the man in the sports car. That single moment, that brief interaction, had changed him. He had learned so much from that encounter. It wasn't just about the man's identity or the car he drove. It was about seeing past the surface, questioning his own assumptions, and learning to treat people with respect and understanding, regardless of their background. The officer had always believed in fairness, but now he understood that true fairness came from empathy and open-mindedness. It wasn't always easy. There were times when old habits crept in, when the officer would feel the urge to judge a situation too quickly. But each time, he reminded himself of that lesson, to slow down and see things from a different perspective. He had learned to stop rushing to conclusions, to take a moment to breathe and understand the person in front of him. One afternoon, the officer had a conversation with a colleague who had been with the force for many years. They talked about their work, about the cases they'd handled, and the people they had encountered. His colleague, like the officer had been, was focused on the rules, the procedure, and the need to uphold the law. But as they spoke, the officer found himself adding his own perspective, the one he had learned through his reflection and self-awareness. "I've started looking at things differently," he admitted. "It's not just about following the rules. It's about understanding why people do what they do, and who they really are." His colleague raised an eyebrow, a little surprised, but listened intently. The officer continued, "Sometimes, people are more than just their actions. We don't always know what someone is going through or what has shaped them. I've realized that part of our job isn't just enforcing the law. It's about showing respect and fairness to everyone, not based on their appearance or what they drive, but based on who they are as individuals." His colleague nodded thoughtfully, and the officer could see the wheels turning in his friend's mind. It was a small victory, but it felt meaningful. Even if his colleague didn't fully embrace the idea, the officer had planted a seed. It wasn't just about changing one person's perspective. It was about changing the way he approached every part of his job, and he hoped that would eventually influence others around him. The officer started to notice a shift in his own relationships within the community. He became more approachable, more open, and people responded to him differently. He had become someone who truly listened, who didn't judge right away, and who sought to understand before acting. In one particularly powerful moment, a woman who had been involved in a minor traffic accident thanked him for his calm approach when she was visibly upset. "You treated me like a person, not just another driver," she said. It made all the difference. Her words hit him hard. And in that moment, he knew that this change wasn't just for him. It was something that made a real impact on the lives of others. As the officer drove through the streets, his mind clear and focused, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had learned the hard way to never judge a book by its cover. He had learned the importance of seeing people as individuals, with their own stories, struggles, and triumphs. The work was far from over, but each step he took, each interaction, felt like progress. And with each passing day, he knew he was becoming the kind of officer and the kind of person he had always hoped to be. The officer had come a long way from that first encounter with the man in the sports car. It wasn't just a matter of his professional life changing. It had affected his personal life as well. He had started seeing things with more clarity, approaching every situation with a renewed sense of empathy and understanding. Each day felt like a fresh opportunity to continue growing, to make a difference, no matter how small the gesture seemed. As time passed, the officer started to notice how much his shift in mindset had affected the way people responded to him. No longer was he just the officer who showed up with a ticket book in hand. People began to trust him more. They saw him not as someone to fear, but as someone who genuinely wanted to understand and help. Whether it was a minor traffic stop or a more serious situation, the officer had learned to connect with people in a way that went beyond his badge and uniform. He realized that it was not enough to just do the job. He needed to be present, to listen, and to treat everyone with dignity. One evening, he was at a local community event. a small neighborhood gathering to raise awareness about crime prevention. He had been asked to speak, but he wasn't entirely sure what he was going to say. As he stood in front of the crowd, looking out at the faces of the people he had come to know, something inside him clicked. He thought about the lesson he had learned, about how important it was to see people for who they truly were. "I've been a police officer for many years," he began, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "And over the years, I've learned that it's not just about enforcing the law. It's about the people we serve, the people we meet, and the lives we touch. And I've realized that how we treat others, how we see others, matters more than anything." He went on to share the story of the man in the sports car, though he didn't go into every detail. He told them how, in that brief encounter, he had learned not to judge too quickly, not to assume things based on appearances. He spoke about the importance of understanding the context of each person's life and how everyone deserved to be treated with respect, no matter their background or how they looked. The crowd listened attentively, and the officer could feel the weight of his words. This wasn't just about his personal growth. It was about sharing a lesson that could help everyone become more compassionate, more understanding, and more aware of their own biases. As the evening continued, he saw the impact of his words. People approached him, thanked him for his honesty, and shared their own stories with him. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that the work he was doing was about more than just safety. It was about building bridges and understanding. Driving home that night, the officer felt a sense of peace. He knew he still had much to learn, and there would always be room for growth. But for the first time in a long time, he felt confident that he was on the right path. His work had meaning beyond just protecting and serving. It had meaning in how he saw the world and the people around him. The officer realized that it wasn't just about getting the job done. It was about making a lasting, positive impact on the community, and he had finally found that purpose. It wasn't about a flashy car, an assumption, or a mistake. It was about taking the time to see people for who they were and understanding that we all have something valuable to offer. And as the officer reflected on how far he had come, he knew that this was just the beginning of a much deeper journey, one that would continue to shape his life and the lives of those he served.